So I wanted to ask actually all of our speakers. So in Mina Loy's feminist manifesto, she says that the feminist movement, as at present instituted, as is inadequate. There is no half measure, no scratching on the surface of the rubbish heap of tradition will bring reform. The only method is absolute demolition. So I'm wondering to our speakers, if you were, firstly, how does feminism feel inadequate to you today? And if you were to demolish it, build it out again?
Okay, I'll start. So yeah, it was really interesting what Kuchenga was saying earlier about Virginia Woolf and space, and she was talking about having how this balance that obviously Virginia Woolf wrote about between and the value of domestic, or what we call domestic work. And I think for me that would be clearly, and I'm really fascinated. I've written an article recently about when I gave birth to my last daughter, and when I was in the maternity ward, I had this moment where I imagined I was breastfeeding her. She'd just been born, and I was imagining breastfeeding being like an Olympic sport. I was probably at that point slightly doped out of the hormones, but the idea, and I don't mean that in any way of a kind of prettifying of domesticity and it being just attached to women, but I mean a re-evaluating of what we consider to feed the capitalist system, and what we consider to be intellectual or high arts. In the baking column, I've been writing a baking column recently inspired by Leonora Carrington called Riding the Baking Edge. And it's very much a kind of spontaneous juxtaposition of philosophy, I'm pronouncing with a French accent, philosophy, cooking, literary ideas around food. And I very much like that kind of hybrid thing. And I think for me, that version of feminism would include I'm very much in the idea of Decorating Dissidence, actually, which I really like about the website. And I've really relished looking at it, in the idea of looking at certain activities and how we attach them to sexuality and gender, and how we place them hierarchically and value them within a liberal capitalist system. Which as women currently, many of us will be juggling all of those things. So yeah, that would be definitely something I feel very strongly.
I think you have to kind of judge what you're up against. It seems to me that for decades we've been trying to do just that, and it's never worked. And different methods have been tried, and I mean, traditionally, the female art was sort of getting around the men to get their own way. I don't think that works either too well, but we'd have to have a complete, really good plan if you were going to demolish everything. What exactly are you going to put in its place? And you've got to have positives for that. You can't just be negative about what you don't want. And I don't know, have we got enough positives? Have we been allowed to have enough positives through our education system and through a female solidarity? I mean, I think female solidarity is better now than it was. It went through a kind of early feminist phase of real enthusiasm, and then it just sort of lapsed, and all the kind of consumerism took off and kind of took over. So I don't know. I mean, this would be wonderful if you could demolish everything and start again. But what would you do with all those men hanging around? That's the problem. Who wouldn't want what you wanted? I just don't know. I don't know quite how it would work. I'd love it if it would.
Can I pop in there? Not to speak for Kuchenga, obviously, because no one could do that. She's got an incredible voice, and it's a shame that she couldn't be here for this part of the discussion, because I think as a trans woman, she would have had some amazing things to say. But I suppose for me, primarily, and also in light of some of the difficult trolling we've had in the last sort of day or so for this event, I just think it's more, what would make a really massive, significant change would be for white women, white middle-class women, to really be aware of their privilege, their complicity, and their collusion, and how they use feminism, and how they can use it to include instead of exclude Black and brown women, because I feel like this is still very much something that is not resolved. I think we've got a long way to go, and a lot of my work is looking into this at the moment, because I work on Mary Wollstonecraft, who is obviously deemed the mother of feminism, which I don't agree with. And I think even in people deeming her the mother of feminism, you can see the white middle class of, I suppose, domination of feminism and exclusion of particular groups and bodies. And yeah, so that's just, I know it's hard for us all to hear, particularly as I think there's a lot of white women in this group who are probably wonderful and allies and whatnot, but I think that as also a white woman, I have to do that work. I have to be more self-reflective, be accountable, think about how I can move out of the way and let other people take the microphone. I'm going to shut up in a minute. Speak and be heard and have a platform, and I just don't see that happening enough. I think, and I know this is a very old thing to say. I shouldn't have to say it in 2020, but you still see it. You see it on Twitter. You see it on other social media platforms. You see it on the news. It's just, feminism is so whitewashed, and I think that's what, as women, we need to ensure that we are, we don't have our backs to people, and we don't exclude people, and that we hear others. So, yeah.
That's brilliant, Hannah. Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, it made me think of Hannah Höch called Half Caste, where it's of a Black woman, but her mouth is covered by the mouth of a white woman. And it's kind of interesting, similar to what you were saying, that feminism is so whitewashed, and even like that collage is kind of representative of that, because feminism is like shown through the white experience so often that it's kind of, we need to take away the mouth and let people speak for themselves. Yeah.
I just wanted to say one more thing as well.
Yeah. Go on.
It was also because of the trouble with the TERFs that we had, a lot of people very, very kindly sent DMs, which was just so lovely. And I had a really interesting discussion with somebody in the DM message that she sent me, and we were talking about how so much of the really, really important work is done by Black women, is done by Black and brown women, and somebody was writing in on the Google Doc about citations and using Sarah Ahmed, and it's just, this is so key. Like, not only is it about giving credit where credit is due, but obviously like acknowledging whose backs and shoulders you're standing on, who has laid those foundations, who's laid those foundations, who's done the sort of the work from the ground upwards, not just constantly speaking into this sort of white middle class zone, and it just gets stuck in this middle sphere. I don't know, I'm not explaining it right, but do you know what I mean? So I think, yeah, it's about, yeah, I think just more self-reflection really for any significant change to even be put in motion, and to just really acknowledge acknowledge the work that's been done before us and is being done by Black and brown women. Yeah.
There's the notion as well, and within that, of listening. I think creating a space, I think when you're talking, I think there's that question of not talking, and then there's also that question of listening. And I work with a lot of people with schizophrenia, adults. At the beginning of my career, I worked with children, and now the last 10 years I've worked with mainly adults with different forms of psychosis. And listening to the group of people, and what that group of people, and that whole thing of listening to young women as well, or listening to older women, and listening to, and creating that space where people are pulling back, and we can listen, and listening to Black women, and the fact of allowing these voices, I think, and what people actually want, and not a definition of what we think other people want. And I think funnily enough, I was brought up in a commune by quite radical feminists. So I spent most of my childhood. And to give you an idea, for example, I used to be harassed for wearing makeup when I was a kid. It was like you couldn't wear makeup, you couldn't have hair, you had to have hair under your arms, and it's really interesting when you've grown up in that, and a lot of those values I've taken on board. I have a partner who does most of the childcare. For example, during COVID, I've gone out to work and he's been at home, and I think, but that it was really interesting growing up in that type of environment and realizing quite how oppressive also feminism can be, if it dictates to you something, which for me as a young woman it sometimes did, which didn't correspond with my needs or how I wanted to express myself.
And I was also thinking about language, and kind of like the language we use, and especially within our work, I suppose, how language can be subverted, or how we can change the meaning of language to kind of put across new ideas and create new meaning. So I'm wondering how language influences your work, and also what are the ways in which you might subvert language in your work to all of our speakers.
Well, I'm a bit different to Susanna because I'm immersed in my PhD, so I'm not managing to be as creative at the moment, as creative as I'd really love to be. But words are, I suppose, I'm coming up against certain words at the moment because of people's offence. They're using the offence they feel through certain terms and words as a defence, and they claim that sort of victim status. Not just thinking about the TERFs, and thinking about my department, because we're trying to force them to put pressure on them to decolonize the space, the curriculum they're teaching, and there's certain words that they're really struggling with, and it kind of blocks conversation. So I think, and yet we don't want to compromise on those terms because they connect to truth, and we shouldn't have to compromise on certain terms and certain words. So I suppose that's just, it's just sort of one thing that I've been thinking about, how words that I think are really important to say, however hard they are in the mouth, however difficult it is to utter them, to articulate them, other people cannot even utter them, they cannot even see them on the page, and that's a real problem, and it shows the power of language, so it shows the power of words. So anyway, I'm going to stop because I know that Elodie and Susanna and you have amazing things to say.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there, just from what you, kind of following on from what you were saying, Hannah, that, yeah, I think language is absolutely vital, and especially at the moment, because it's pretty much all we have. I think it's like we don't have touch, we don't have the body language that we often do have in interactions. we're kind of reduced to either a 2-meter distance or words on a screen, whether they're spoken or written or whatever. So it's like, I mean, I think language is incredibly important anyway, but especially at the moment, it feels like it's framing everything, and it's taken on a real significance. And especially when there's so much emotive stuff going on at the moment, I think it really shows how a single word can change the tone of an entire message or tweet or email or whatever it is that's being written or said. And I think in a way, just kind of going back to the how would you reframe feminism and redo feminism, I think an awareness of language has to be a massive part of that. I don't see how we can take feminism forward in any way unless we have a real kind of awareness of what we're saying and an awareness of how it's going to impact on others. And also an awareness that other people might not agree with what we're saying. And that's okay, they're entitled to their views. But that, you know, language is that powerful, and we can use it for good or we can not use it for good. And that's a choice we all have to make every single day. But yeah, it's a really important one.
So does the kind of Dada tradition of deconstructing language, is it actually harder now to do that? Because do we all share the same language anyway? And it seems to be changing faster than ever. I mean, in 1914, 1920, there was a tradition of written language which you either agreed with or not, but it was there and they could do something with it. But I mean, it's do you think it's harder now or not? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I stumble over, I find that I can blunder into expressions that are no longer relevant just by not having kept up with how things are changing, especially through social media. So, I mean, I don't know, are we living with a slightly Darderesque language anyway, in the way that we're communicating?
I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking back to kind of the original avant-garde and Dada, and I don't know, I assume a lot of people are familiar with the little magazine Transition, which was quite famous for the stuff that it printed, the real kind of, at the time, subversive in the way that its contributors used language and used different forms of the language as well. And it would be really interesting, like, do we have anything similar to that today? I don't know, what do people think?
Yeah, I think with Dadaism, what's really fascinating as well is the way language was used at the Cabaret Voltaire. And the Carawan, I don't know if everyone's familiar with that, but like the sound poetry. So where they were using kind of like, whoa, and speaking in kind of forms of, you know, what one would consider to be gobbledygook. But then there was this actual later Hugo Ball, and it was also his partner, who's another footnote, unfortunately, Emmy Hemmings, who did some of these performances, and yeah, it's really interesting, because was that a kind of reaction against language then having no meaning, going to a kind of speaking in tongues type language to search for a sort of spirituality through language, and almost find it's you know, very interesting, just the whole place of language within human beings' development, as we're the kind of only speaking animals or the speaking mammals. And yeah, I think I feel like that kind of breaking down of language, because I work bilingually, so I write in both English and in French, and I experimented recently about a year ago in a collaboration where I wrote hybrid text which mixed the two languages. And it really came to me, that project, when I saw the reactions when there was the trolling thing about women's with the X, because I really thought to myself, why can we not reinvent language? Language has constantly been reinvented throughout history. If you look at French and English, there's constant words that have crossed from one culture to another. And we at home we speak bilingually, and my partner's Jewish, and I picked up quite a lot of Yiddish, and there's this kind of mixing, and he speaks Spanish as well. And it's really, I think it's really important to recognize the kind of etymological history of language, and then also to have this possibility as well to look at what language means to different people, but also to allow ourselves to restructure language, because language has been constructed. Language isn't like a neutral, it's not a neutral thing. It has its own history. It has so many aspects and the connotations of different words in different cultures. And I think having a knowledge and an explanation of that, it is so important. It's so important.
I love that point. Sorry, just like it is constructed, and we're now kind of angry at the fact that some of the words, particularly, I'm obviously thinking about Enlightenment thought and philosophy and theory, and some of the terms that gave birth to, we're now trying to deconstruct today, and people are angry. You've got people angry that those terms exist, that those words limit and oppress others, and then you have people that want to defend them because it's, you know, it's embedded in our structures and the way we think and the way we relate. I'm thinking specifically about race, obviously, here still. And people getting angry when you say you're white, and, you know, well, you created that category, so deal with it, you know. And it's the same, like we've got to understand like the origins of words, maybe also to break them down and to understand why they're oppressive to an extent and why they can liberate in other instances. But also I was thinking about feminism has been scrutinizing language for ages, and yet we're still here, and we're still not listening to some people. Going back to your point about listening as well, we're still not listening to how some words oppress others within the sort of feminist lexicon, and other terms and words give life and recognize the lived experiences and reality of minority groups. And that's why we use the term women, obviously, for this event with the X. And it's so frustrating that people can't recognize that some terminology, it gives life and light to particular people that are denied that day in, day out, and that they feel that they have a right to get angry at that when their day-to-day lives aren't, you know, put in the shadows and denied and erased. So that's, I'm not going to say any more, but that's just sort of when I was listening to you talk about language and reinventing it and deconstructing it, that's sort of what was going on in my head.
That's a really interesting point, and it's kind of just jumping in here, but it's brought me back to the ideas that we were talking about earlier about space and physical space.
Yeah, I think as well what's important, and I think one thing we can really take from Dada as well, is that very kind of playful idea about it as well. And I think that's one of the things I thought about when I saw the WOMXN was that who gives a shit? Do it. The kind of like allowing that and it's something that's been written a lot in the comparison between Dada and punk, and this very, and when you see this kind of, you know, the thing I love with Dada of just like, you know, taking anything that you can see in front of you, like now, like we could all just look in front of us and we'd kind of grab 5 objects and write a poem from it, and that we could reconstruct language like that, and having that kind of sort of, there's such a joyful rage in Dadaism, but I think that spirit of humour and playfulness is actually something, because I think that's a very important intentionality, which I think can have very interesting results when one works with that playfulness.
Yeah, and also I was kind of just thinking about language and what Hannah was saying before about like terms and how we use language, and specifically I was thinking about when Hannah was talking about white people and how they didn't like that term, but also kind of the inherent understanding person terms related to certain groups of people. I was thinking kind of in my own experience of being a Black person, and people telling me that I sound like a white person or I act like a white person, and kind of meaning it in a complimentary way, but at the same time kind of like, well, actually that's not a compliment at all, and you're completely like disregarding my race and who I am as a person. And so I think, yeah, it is really interesting, and we do need to kind of think about the language and vocabulary we use around certain topics, areas, and like think about the impact that it's having, because a lot of the time the people who have said it to me don't realize that it's a bad thing, and they think they're saying a nice thing to me or like a complimentary thing, which I find really interesting and also ridiculous.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Rochelle, I just had to say, and it really angers me and frustrates me at the same time, but also it's going back to like what words are inscribed with, obviously, because I think people react when they talk about, you know, whiteness or blackness or whatever, and what they're not really tuning into is what they're inscribing into that whiteness, what they're inscribing into that blackness, and it's the inscription that we need to destroy. It's what's encoded into these things that we need to we need to empty these words. It's not that we need to completely scrap them, but we need to empty them of their former associate or their current associations and their histories, obviously. And we can only do that if we, I think, as Susanna says, like sit with them, confront them, play with them, unpick them, unpack them.
Yeah, it's like the image, is coming to my mind as though what you're saying, Hannah, it's like they're these words, and that they kind of like up here, and then what people don't realize is almost like geologically they're what root, like there's a whole kind of infrastructure that they're representing, and taking them apart is helping that tumble.
I like the idea of geology, because that's what Dada is also kind of. I don't know enough about Dada in comparison to everybody in this meeting, but it does seem like it's about the echoes between words and form, like playing around with that, obviously, in certain poetic forms and collages and whatnot, and geology has a similar thing of like what is being carried forth, what is being discarded, what is still there amongst the sediments. I'm rambling now, but I just wanted to say, is it so? Maya has written some fantastic things in the chat, as has Jennifer B, and so mentioned Stuart Hall, and words are given legally binding force, and they have more implicit social meanings that are connected to legal and state enforcement, especially words for bodies and identities. And obviously, how does that play out in space? Obviously, so I just thought that was such a brilliant point. So I'm flagging it up.
That's great, thanks, Hannah. And that, your points and that point is brilliant. And it's kind of making me think of the idea of how much this notion of the other is ingrained in our language, and how we all use it every day, probably without even thinking about it. And yet it's always reinforcing the idea that there's us and there's them. And that maybe, I think that's actually one of the things that Dada is really good at, with its playfulness and its subversion of language and subversion of space, is breaking down those ideas to a certain extent of the other. And that is something, you know, to take forward, just an awareness of that idea of the other being so ingrained in our language that we use.
I wonder, kind of also an interesting point is kind of taking a language and implementing humour, I guess, which Darderesque did, to kind of re-look at or readdress or kind of change the meaning of certain things. And I'm kind of, I guess I'm interested to know if any of our speakers use or think about humour within their work to kind of subvert language or subvert ideas.
Yeah, the Leonora Carrington inspired baking column that I did is very tongue-in-cheek. but in that kind of joyful rage stuff, because it includes like yoga exercises, or I don't know, love and dance theory, and then cookery. And I did one at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, which I then did about bread and protest, because it then felt really complicated to be writing about baking during those first weeks. And I asked the editor not to publish it at first. And then I wrote one which was about protest and the role of food in protest. But yeah, I think humour is such a powerful tool. It's very difficult to manage. I think it's quite a hot coal, and it really needs to be finely balanced when one uses it. But yeah, I feel like it's very, I know for me, even in my work as a therapist, it's something that often can really help people as well when they're dealing with stuff that's very difficult. I worked on a film project for 4 years with a French filmmaker called Gilles Blanchard about the French sculptress Camille Claudel, who was hospitalised in a psychiatric hospital and died. She was Rodin's partner, then defined as muse, etc. But we worked together for 4 years with over 200 patients. And it was so extraordinary because we produced a feature-length film and a number of short films. And one of the things that we both said when we presented or used to present the project, which we often did with patients as well, was how much we'd laughed. And how much we just, but these moments where we'd laughed, moments where we'd cried, and yeah, this very humane thing with laughter. I think it's when you work in hospitals, it's one of the things you learn is how much you laugh with doctors and nurses, and I have done over the COVID period. Because it's a kind of form, I guess, of joy and human resilience, and allows that distance to happen between that kind of raw emotion, which we all, tumble into and then can sometimes get quite lost. And I think humour just is that tiny, pas de côté, you'd say in French, it's like that tiny step where you kind of step back and then you can suddenly reconfigure and reinvent in a different way.
Do you think that it's harder for a new Dada movement to use outrage in the same way as the early one did? I mean, particularly the women that you've been focusing on, they just, had a wonderful time dressing up as they wanted and just doing what they wanted and outraging norms, and sort of got away with it. It would be kind of It would be criticised, but not in the way that it might be now. I mean, do you think that there's still a place for real extrovert demonstration that's not going to get beaten down and destroyed?
Do you think they did get away with it? Because when you look at, I don't know, Emmy Hemmings or so many of them, Leonora Carrington was shut up in a mental asylum and she was a surrealist, but I don't know, I feel like so many of them were literally, like they look like that in photos, but do you think they were, obviously some of them were having a fun time, but it's a bit like life on Instagram. I don't know. Do you think they were having that much fun?
Well, I don't know. I'm curious to know. I'm curious to know if it would. I mean, they were obviously trying to, and they were trying to show how they were, going against all the norms. But I mean, how can we compare that now? How can you get attention without it being beaten down at the first minute anyone sees it?
I guess people like Pussy Riot, stuff like that. I don't know, that's the kind of thing it makes me think of. Even Lady Gaga.
Yeah, I mean, that's another interesting point, someone like that.
I mean, I think with the original Dadists as well, I mean, certainly with somebody like the Baroness Elsa, I mean, she was really kind of out there in her art, but at the time and for quite a while afterwards, I mean, she was relegated to people basically laughed at her and said she was insane, and she was almost like a tourist attraction on the streets of Greenwich Village and nothing more. She wasn't taken seriously as an artist, and I don't know whether that's something that we would also have to kind of watch out for, I suppose. Now it's like, not only do you not want your protest to be kind of beaten down at the first opportunity, but also how do you get it to be taken seriously and not just dismissed as another feminist thing, or a woman having a bit of fun type of thing. And I'm saying specifically a woman having a bit of fun, because I think if it was a man, it would probably be a very different situation. It's kind of sad but true.
Well, I think there's a class element as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
We haven't talked about yet. There's it's a very important. I mean, even now, although it's much more fluid, it's still there, and the patriarchy is still there, whether you want to accept it or not. It's going to have an impact on what you want to say. So, I mean, it seems to me there are quite a lot of differences between reviving a Dada movement and having it, the core ideas of protest there. It's got to be done differently now. I think there are different hazards now for women to circumvent.
I'm really interested in the class element. I wrote an essay last year about the Yellow Jackets movement in France. And it's such an interesting movement, which was defended by a really great French philosopher called Cynthia Fleury, who I don't think is translated that much into English, but it was also really defended by Edouard Louis, who is a French writer who's very well known now in the UK, who writes autofiction and about class and sexuality. And what's really interesting about the Yellow Jackets movement was that the French bourgeoisie came out very much as, and they occupied space in a really fascinating way, because they occupied roundabouts and they occupied peripheral supermarket space. They were on the edges of towns. They didn't use union movements, which are very strong traditionally in France. And it was really interesting to see how their forms of protest were rejected because they didn't conform. And it was massive. I mean, during the months where there was that Yellow Jackets movement in France, you would literally drive around towns and you'd get blocked. And you saw on the news, I'm sure, the images of all the violence in Paris, but when you actually, there was very specific legal things that were happening. So for example, you weren't allowed paramedics during the demonstrations. So there was a lot of police violence, but there was also a friend of mine worked as like what they call a street paramedic. So he was like an undeclared paramedic. And it was really fascinating because it was a working class and lower middle class movement. And yet didn't adhere to these things and therefore was rejected. And I'll just add this in quickly. I wrote in Anne Quinn, who for me, I put her name, and I would say she's one of if you don't know her, she's a British working class writer who's probably one of the closest things to a kind of contemporary, she's dead now, but there's Unmapping the Country, which is one of the closest things with a kind of collage Dadaist type writing and surrealist type writing that I really recommend you read her. She's great. She's almost like an Iris Murdoch novel told from the other side. She's a queen.